Great. So, welcome everybody. Dr. Paul here for Romantopedia, Romantic Dynamics, and Psychology, and then my own Substack. Here we go. I am joined here, Dr. Paul. I'm joined here by Dr. Simon Rogoff, and we've got some people streaming in to take a look. Dr. Simon Rogoff, who I've been following on Substack for some time. He is a British psychologist, lives in London. He has a great Substack, and he's a deep thinker, especially on the topic of narcissism in all of its forms, pathologic narcissism and just global narcissism. An interest of mine for about 30 years and an interest of his, and I think he has a unique perspective to give us on this important topic, especially since you see so much more narcissism in society, and it's growing to the point where it's become a hot topic in the media for at least 10 years now. And now we see something new to me that I've really taken a deep dive into in the past year is the concept of narcissistic abuse, which is an outgrowth, I think, of domestic violence studies. And Dr. Simon is, I believe, kind of an expert in the area of forensic psychology and has studied the psychology of prisons and prisoners. And so he has that kind of background as well for us to look at. Welcome, Dr. Simon.
Thanks, Dr. Paul. Good to be with you.
Thanks for being here. And just so everybody knows, if you want to check out his Substack, he is at the @ Simon, Simon, Rogoff, Rogoff. Okay, for those of you interested, you should check out his writing and what he produces. So we're here talking about narcissism, a gigantic global topic and a hot topic in the media, as I said, for a number of years. How would we define narcissism in a way that's maybe more useful to the public? Because as we were discussing before coming on here, there's this word toxic that's being used kind of as a bludgeon by bullies to label others that they don't like, and they call them toxic. And I think that is just a synonym for narcissism. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I guess my concern is that sometimes we can avoid just naming the behavior that is hurting us. If we're being hurt by behavior, then it's usually helpful to try and name the behavior and try and name what the impact is on us that we don't want to be there. And narcissism has become a kind of a leap on from that, trying to identify, if you like, what the pathology is behind the hurtful behavior, if it is hurtful. And yeah, it's become quite a wide label that has many definitions, and that's become a problem as well. And people use it sometimes interchangeably with psychopathy, which is probably better understood as a much more severe version of this, when there are actually kind of aspects of narcissism which we actually admire as well, in smaller doses, in performers perhaps, or leaders that are helpful leaders sometimes.
I think about that. I think in modern times we sometimes forget the importance of history, and there even used to be university departments called the History and Philosophy of Science department, where you would study how did we reach today's science by way of the thinkers that came before. And I think it really fleshes out a deeper understanding of things, especially such topics as narcissism. So I think of Freud, I think of Anna Freud, I think of George Vaillant with his ego defense system structures, going from primitive to immature to neurotic, an old word, to mature. And you can even go as far back as Aristotle and think of the Aristotelian, the Nicomachean Ethics, and the Aristotelian virtues and vices, and the golden mean of on either side of a virtue are two vices, not one, but two vices. I think vice is narcissism. I think narcissism is immaturity. But put it in common person language at ground level, it's like being a child in an adult's body. It's being a primitive, immature person run by instincts and impulses and acting out rather than slowing things down, being thoughtful, mindful, well-boundaried, and wise in decisions, I think.
Yeah. And one of the great paradoxes of narcissism is this childlikeness or childishness can look really powerful and intimidating at the same time. So the idea, which is you're right that it's childishness, and then a kind of immaturity or a maladaptation, it can be the opposite of what it actually kind of looks like, that we can be really impressed by narcissism, we can be intimidated by it, and yet underneath there are side effects of that which can be quite problematic, and it could be described as a characterological problem or a personality disorder in severe form, and yet yes, it can be also childish underneath. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned celebrities, and there have been some public figures public intellectuals who've studied celebrities. Dr. Phil and Dr. Drew in America, and
Yeah.
there's one institute in the whole world that studies the psychology of celebrity, and it's called the Norman Lear Institute. He was a decades-long television producer here. So it's interesting. We all look at celebrities and we see their lives put on display. So there's all this data to try to interpret. Although if we've never met them, we can't be that accurate. But it's a starting point on talking about this subject.
Yeah, I read Dr. Drew's book. What's it called? The Mirror Effect, I think. He comes from an addiction kind of background, and in the how narcissism manifests in celebrity sometimes. Yeah, I'm really interested in the why. Why do people need to be narcissistic, if you like? What drives the behavior? What drives a kind of a set of strategies that we could call narcissistic?
Yeah, I've never told you this. We've been getting to know each other, but I started out in psychiatry just because of one psychiatrist professor way back in the day. Unfortunately, he's deceased at this point, but his name was Horatio Fabrega. And when I did my rotation in psychiatry, I was going to become a surgeon instead. But when I did my rotation in psychiatry, I asked him what he studied, and he said, "Well, I'm kind of a vampire hunter." And I said,
Right.
"What? That sounds interesting. A vampire hunter psychiatrist? What do you mean by that?" And he goes, "Well, I'm an anthropologic psychiatrist, which is kind of unusual, but I study world cultures and what's in common in them. And my focus of some of my research has been about vampires, monster stories, werewolves, mummies, any kind of monster, Beowulf in ancient to modern literature. What are monster stories about? Because they exist in every culture of the world.
Yeah.
Every culture has a vampire analog villain in their folklore." And he said it's to teach the culture about narcissism.
Wow.
Monster stories are to learn about what are the features of narcissism, how do you recognize it, avoid it, not get seduced by it, not become victim to it, and maybe even how do you defeat it in others.
That's really interesting.
Stories.
So yeah, what's narcissistic about the vampire? There's quite a lot, isn't there? It's intimidating, it's powerful,
charming,
yeah,
handsome, or beautiful, seductive, and yet weak, not quite alive, and looks in the mirror and doesn't see anything. Looking in the mirror, you don't see, the vampire can't be seen, and put a stake through their heart, or the light of day. Both of those imply confrontation with reality, confrontation with truth, like the light of day, illumination.
You make me think of the picture of Dorian Gray, because it's not a mirror, is it? It's a painting. But one of the books I have talks about that story as being a really good illustration of narcissism, that what people see is bright and youthful and impressive and attractive, and yet somewhere there's an underbelly of that, another side, which if it were shown would destroy the whole effect. And sometimes we see that, don't we, in the fall from grace of the celebrity. We see somebody almost go from being the shiny, charismatic, perfect, idealized person, and we see the other extreme almost. And then we have to try and reconcile these two versions of somebody that were both there all the time.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just saying hi to Rebecca.
Oh, hi, Becca. One of the things I've noticed as a kind of a cultural effect is I'm interested in sort of the slang people use, synonyms that they use, just to maybe dumb down the lofty concepts of, Kernberg and Kohut and Freud just to everyday life. And I think of bullies. I mean, everybody has has a conception of what is a bully on a schoolyard playground. I mean, I
Yeah.
had plenty of bullies in my youth. I don't know if you had them, but one of the things I've noticed both in the media and blogs and journalism about narcissism and also in schoolyard bullies is a tendency to take synonyms of narcissism like the word toxic or toxicity and just slap it on somebody's immutable traits. For example, toxic male, toxic masculinity. And it reminds me of school days and bullies where their technique would be they would take something unique to you that you were born with, like you're male or you're Italian or you're Irish or your whatever your nationality is, and then slap a pejorative negative label on top of it, like dirty, rotten, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I think toxic male and toxic masculinity are that exact same concept. It's putting a pejorative with an immutable trait and then being
And what's the
derogatory toward a
outcome?
person.
The impact is a kind of that you need to be ashamed of being X. You know, it might be your gender, it might be your race, it might be anything. Yeah.
Or an objective of just grabbing power from you. And what they say these days, devalue you.
Yeah.
Have you this has been new to me only in the past year, because the concept of narcissistic abuse, and I'm so interested in it because it's so new to me. I think it's because it's social and it's interpersonal, whereas I was always trained and educated on narcissism in isolation, just inside an individual by
Right.
themselves,
Okay.
as opposed to what happens interpersonally when somebody's highly narcissistic. Maybe the other person's narcissistic too, but then they call it narcissistic abuse and it becomes a dynamic thing.
Yeah.
Are you educated at that, or have you read about
Well,
that?
I came into interest in narcissism through interest in personality disorder, which is a more severe form of narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. But personality disorders are often characterized by as an interpersonal problem, a relational. They show up. Personality disorder often shows up in relationships, particularly in the kind of cluster B DSM personality disorder. So I suppose
Yeah.
I was introduced to narcissism as a kind of an interpersonal problem that shows up interpersonally, whether it be, and I guess I was introduced more in the kind of Kernberg and side of the object relationship version of it, which is about the kind of roles we find ourselves in what Kernberg calls dyads, in a relationship with another person. What
Yeah.
role do I find myself taking up? It could be the bullying role, it could be some kind of powerful role, or it could be an admired role. So it's still a pop star needs an audience, even if it's an audience of one, and there's some kind of need to be admired or a need for, as you say, power over somebody else, or control, or a need to be the judge in relation to someone else who is being judged or shamed in the playground, even, as you're saying.
Yeah. The concept of shame is it's taking something away from another person. It's stealing something from them. It's drawing something out of them and taking it for yourself, right? It's one-upping someone.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I
well,
like
what I
to
was
think
going
of
to
it
ask
also.
you,
Go on.
no, please go ahead.
I was just thinking that if I'm judging somebody, even the playground simplifies things, doesn't it? I find it quite useful to think, how does this work
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
playground?
yeah,
And it gives you some
yeah,
distance. Let's simplify. But even in the playground, if you're shaming somebody for whatever characteristic, you are not the shamed. It's clear that there's who the shamed person is in that dyad, in that relationship, and you are almost the opposite of the shamed. So one thing, it steals something from somebody, and at the same time, it puts the shamer, the narcissistic person, as it were, in a position of definitely not being ashamed. And I think for me, I'm drawn to that aspect of it more than anything else. I think the
huh?
avoidance of being in the other role, the best way to avoid shame is to be the judge, in a way, in
Right,
the opposite
right.
role.
To have righteous indignation toward
Yeah,
this and
and
that and
that as an
everything.
escape.
Yeah,
Yeah, as a relief
yeah.
from something.
Well,
There are other
it
ways of
reminds
looking
me
at it,
of
aren't there?
what I was going to say is, back to vampires and, cultural anthropologic studies of this and Horatio Fabrica. If a vampire sucks blood, and that's what vampires are all about, is staying alive by way of
Mm.
sucking blood, what is that it's symbolic of or a metaphor for? I think if you combine monster stories and vampire stories with the notion of the triune brain model of Paul MacLean, reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and higher brain, kind of
Yeah.
like an evolutionary psychology amalgam of this with Jungianism. What you get is vampires taking blood is symbolic of a narcissist robbing someone else of their self-esteem, which is their emotion of happiness. Because self-esteem always correlates with how happy are you versus depressed and anxious. So they're stealing your self-esteem to fill up and stay alive for a little while longer. Then they need to move on and suck another victim's blood,
Yeah,
which is their self-esteem.
and that's clearly the effect, isn't it? The people who come into unhealthy contact with somebody who's narcissistic ends up with classically with lower self-esteem, and the person who's using these narcissistic strategies goes away with their self-esteem boosted. And
Yes, yeah.
that's the idea. Is
Which
that's why they've done it, in order to boost their self-esteem.
to boost them, yeah.
Are you frozen on me at the moment? I've lost you, Dr. Paul. I don't know if you can hear me. Can anybody else hear me? I've lost Dr. Paul. Can anybody hear me? Oh, you can hear me. Great. Well, I don't know if Dr. Paul can rejoin us. I guess he started the call, so I don't know if he can sort that out. And this is where it'd be good to take calls from somebody who's joined us, but I don't know how to do that. I think I'll have to wait for Dr. Paul. Tell us about this. Yeah, okay. Well, what's fresh in my mind is this article about the age of personality and how character's been being replaced by so-called personality. And I was actually writing about something else, and then I started reading that took me into reading a history of culture book, and then the article went in a different direction. But so I'm going to probably write some more about this. But we can think of character and personality as being interchangeable, but really, when you look at these two concepts, what has become known as personality is much more about what makes us distinctive, what makes us appealing, attractive. And what was known as character was more about actually something Jeremy Fox referenced in an episode with Dr. Paul maybe a week ago. Character is something more about how we manage ourselves. And here's Dr. Paul back again. More about how we manage ourselves and relationships, and whether that leads to how do we manage stress? Does it lead to more stress? Or does it lead to less stress? How do we manage relationships? Does it lead to sustained relationship or volatility? So really, I ended up thinking actually the character and personality are really different, and we've over 100 years moved from one to the other, especially in the people that we admire as societies, as leaders, and as other celebrities. What's that from Dr. Paul? I don't know what that means. You came in and you did make it into the call. Well, I think maybe the solution might be to hang up and start again either. Well, maybe we can start off with that idea.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for it to connect here in a second, and I'll let you know. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Sorry about that. Technical glitch. High temperatures on the device here caused us to have to make a part two. So we're back. Looks like
No chance of that in London.
Is it raining?
It's raining, it's windy, it's cold. It's
Sleet?
January. Yeah,
Boy, yeah. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy at the moment.
it is.
So, I mean, we can talk about Shakespeare too when we talk about monsters. If monster myths exist in all world cultures in order to teach people to naturally evolve within the culture, because narcissism is ever present and it's in everybody all our lives, and it's highly present when we are children. The most narcissistic behavior is the most childish, primitive behavior. So there are monsters in Shakespeare, so to speak, villains, any villain story, hero and
Yeah,
villain. So we were talking about how vampire symbolism as an analogy, or to use the modern pop lexicon of narcissistic abuse, they call it supply, stealing the supply from others. meaning, at least in the mammalian brain, stealing their self-esteem, making them unhappy. You are happy with their unhappiness, right? As a
Yeah.
narcissist. I think win-win versus win-lose behavior, like John Nash from A Beautiful Mind, the game theory of John Nash. Do I want to be a virtuous, mature, patient win-win person that tries to benefit everybody, including
Mm.
myself? Or do I only feel like I can win if I make others lose?
Yeah. And I can't. I keep asking myself, do we get away with? I have this fantasy that we can get away with an idea that narcissism is like a phobia of vulnerability in ourselves. So that if we're with somebody else and we make them vulnerable, or they just happen to be vulnerable for some reason, then we're okay because we're not the vulnerable one
Ah,
emotionally. But it may be more complicated than that. But sometimes I like to think maybe we can just call it a need to distance from vulnerability so that whenever we're powerful, whenever we're talking to somebody else who's clearly emotionally vulnerable, not angry, because that's powerful, but something else, or maybe it is angry and that we identify them as vulnerable. But I think it's probably more complicated than that.
like a savior complex, right?
Yeah. So if
If
somebody
somebody
else,
has to be the savior, then they gravitate to those that maybe are truly vulnerable or maybe keep them that way in
yeah,
subtle, manipulative ways.
which can be uncomfortable for us doctors, can't
It
it? Because
could.
we go to work and society delivers to us people who are defined by vulnerability, but that's not a bad thing. To that point, it's a good thing.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
two modes of that. I mean, there's even an analogy to the world of acting and actors. Since we were talking about celebrities, many years ago, I studied different forms of acting, like method acting, right? And they had theories even back then about why do people enter the, the art of acting. And it divided in two directions. One is a person that needed the attention, the more narcissistic person that just loves having an audience and kind of sucks up the self-esteem from that. And the other person is just somebody, a very curious person who just loves the art of it and learning, like a perpetual student of life. So
Mm,
I think the same is true in the mental health fields. There are narcissistic people that like to feel superior by having those who are more imperiled or vulnerable under them that they're, quote, helping. They probably are helping them, but they get a rush out of that or a rise out of that. But then others, I hope I'm like this, and I know you're like this, who just love learning and are love hearing people's stories and want them to do well and love the idea of science and how it works, being a student of life.
yeah, yeah. And I've been looking at the lives of some iconically famous people and finding some of these other kind of faces of narcissism underneath, even in actors who have rescuing activities in their spare time or kind of perpetrator activities in their spare time. But the actor, yeah, as you say, the actor could desperately need admiration in order to escape, in my the way I think about it, to escape a sense of feelings of vulnerability or shame. The admiration of the audience achieves that for them, and that's fine because the audience enjoys it, the actor enjoys it if they're successful. And we might expect there are costs to fame, though, aren't there? And there was one of the music managers said, I don't know why anybody would want to be famous. It was the Freddie Mercury's manager, Simon Napier Bell, a very famous British pop manager.
Yeah,
He said, I don't know why they have to be running away from something. He didn't use those exact words, but he said, why, once you find what fame's like, why would you want to stay there? Because it's not very nice. So I guess coming back to what you were saying, perhaps if somebody's just curious about inhabiting the worlds of other people as characters, and we might expect them not
yes.
to become iconically famous, at least deliberately, and maybe they might not want to stay there for very long, or I don't know. I'm just kind of theorizing, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, you made me think of a comparison of lots of famous public figures and celebrities just flashed through my mind. And I do think many of them are just so naturally gifted at their art and also curious about it and a perpetual student of it that they just love doing it. And they happen to become famous by others noticing and appreciating their gift. And,
Mm.
they buy a ranch in Montana and live in Montana instead of Hollywood, California, or New York, and don't seek out the fame. Nonetheless,
Mm.
it follows them around and sometimes maybe harasses them. But then
Yeah.
there are the others that just live in the world of how can they create some drama to be seen. And
Yeah.
maybe it's income for them, but it certainly is emotional income for them to do
Yeah, and the costs don't outweigh the benefits. You know that there are costs to the lifestyle, the constant harassment.
that. Yes.
I can only guess, but the
Being,
benefit must outweigh that. They must need to. Maybe it comes back to supply. Maybe they need to be in that spotlight in order to manage themselves. It's just their strategy for being okay, as you said, for having self esteem. Some people carve furniture to have self esteem, don't they? Some people perform and get appreciated in a very performative way.
yeah, I mean, you and I could, do more talks on this. The other areas of psychology that probably are the roots underneath this as an adult might have to do with poor attachments with parents, and they
Yeah.
didn't they didn't like internalize that feeling of love that could become self-love. So now
Mm.
they have to grab it wherever they can grab it, and then it drains right out of them.
Yeah.
I have an Indian friend who is a follower of Hinduism. He was teaching me once about, I got to remember the name. I have to look it up. But the name of one of the Hindu goddesses, who's more of like an evil monster goddess, has a hole in her stomach and has an unquenchable hunger. So she eats and constantly eats and takes in into her mouth. But if you look below, it comes right out the stomach before the nutrition can be absorbed. And so
Right.
she's doomed to be this vampire like, all consuming, never ending consumption creature.
Mm.
So, once again, narcissism represented by monsters.
And it sounds a bit like an addiction, doesn't it? You keep swallowing,
Yes,
but it doesn't. You just need more and more.
yes, never
And I think,
satisfies you.
yeah, and both fame and power can be a bit like that, can't they? They can promise as a strategy. We can look for power, we can look for fame, and they might promise to be the answer to our need. But often we see in celebrities and powerful figures that whatever it was that they were looking for, it didn't really work, or they needed more and more, or that there was a big collapse. And so there's a kind of, I'm interested in this kind of promise that a strategy offers when it might not deliver, and that's the problem with narcissism. If power and control and admiration did deliver consistently, then it wouldn't really be unhealthy necessarily, at least for the narcissistic person. But often there is this kind of collapse, or
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
exhausting to keep
yeah.
it up.
Well, it's not self-generated then. In almost all of my thinking, when I try to do theoretical work or synthesis, I'm always going back to the triune brain model of Paul MacLean and the evolutionary psychologists: reptilian, mammalian, and higher brain. And if you thought of this new idea of narcissistic supply being like the blood, the lifeblood that the vampires go for, or narcissists go after, you could almost think of there being three types of supply, narcissistic supply. One would be higher brain, which would be your intellect getting stolen, poached, plagiarized, or blocked, your voice being blocked intellectually. That's like cancellation. Cancellation is blocking your intellect, right? The narcissist blocks your intellect. And then mammalian brain is about the limbic system and the emotions. And self-esteem is emotional happiness. It's happiness. So the vampire steals your self-esteem or happiness. But last thing I have to say for today on this matter is, go down to the reptilian brain and you're in the world of the masculine and feminine instincts and your core sense of self and dignity as a person. I think that's where shame occurs. So I almost think shame is the cutting down of your core sense of self, in males, perhaps masculinity, and females, femininity, cutting that down. And that's the story of Medusa. It's what Poseidon did to Medusa to turn her into the snake haired monster Medusa was to assault her.
Right.
That was feminine shaming, just like masculine shame is in the story of Narcissus, who died of starvation looking at himself in the pond and ignoring Echo, who thought she loved him, the victim of his literal narcissistic abuse.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking let's do this again. And I want people to know how to see your writing, how to reach you, how to message you perhaps. And my understanding is, at least on Substack, you are at Simon Rogoff, SIMONROGOFF, at
Yeah.
Simon Rogoff.
Best places on Substack, really. I'm just started on Blue Sky and I'm on Threads for the time being. Yeah. Send me a message if you're interested. And I've mainly been writing about iconic fame as a way to understand narcissism, and narcissism as a way to understand fame as well.
Yeah.
And a few other things. Yeah.
Since you're so into music, I wouldn't mind talking about the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, right? The most amazing musician of folklore or myth who ever existed.
I'd have to read up on that. Yeah, maybe next time.
Yeah, the musicians are fascinating to study. We ought to do it.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Yeah, let's do it again. And thank you for being here, Dr. Simon Rogoff.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Paul. And thanks for
Talk to you
everyone
again
for
soon.
tuning in.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.